that Jim Baker gave to Tariq Aziz, their foreign minister, just prior to the war, that hinted at that. Didn't make an explicit threat, but said, you know, we would use any means or whatsoever. Well, it turns out Tariq Aziz never gave the letter to Saddam Hussein because Saddam Hussein didn't like getting bad news. And Aziz said, I'll be damned if I'll get him that letter. He'd probably have me shot, you know, the next day. So we didn't even make the threat, much less know that deterrence worked. And there's been many incidents. I spent 5 years at the Carnegie Endowment studying crises in which there was a threat of nuclear use or a possibility of nuclear use. And in every one of them, you could see how things could have gone very wrong, and we would have gotten into nuclear war. Someone talked about Yeltsin and how fortunate we were that he was drunk. In 1973, there was a war in the Middle East. Israel had surrounded an Egyptian army, and they were dying literally from thirst. They were in the desert. And the Soviets then were threatening to intervene, and they were moving airborne troops to the bases where they would be airlifted. And the U.S. was threatening the Soviet Union, don't intervene because we'll get involved. And so we put our nuclear forces on alert. Well, that night was the height of the Watergate scandal, and President Nixon was dead drunk. I interviewed every person and senior person involved in that crisis. They were in the Situation Room, which is in the West Wing of the White House. President Nixon was in the living quarters, and Alexander Haig, General Haig, who was Chief of Staff, in his greatest service to the country and the world, went back and forth with the purpose of keeping the president out of the Situation Room, because they were very afraid that if he came down there, God knows what he would say. And then what would they do if he made some irrational command about the use of nuclear weapons and so forth. In any situation, you know, it may not be a drunk leader, but it could be a leader who could easily make a mistake, and deterrence would fail. So, you know, I think disarmament is essential. It's the only way to avoid these risks. And moreover, disarmament is something we know how to do. National leaders know how to do it. We have established the precedents for it in this long series of arms control agreements that we have negotiated over now a period of 40 years. What we need is a plan. It's funny, after President Obama now made that speech in Prague, and there were some follow-up things, there was a Security Council meeting where the 5 nuclear weapon states, the presidents all met and pledged they would eliminate nuclear weapons. I went to talk to friends at the Pentagon. I said, so who's working on the plan? Are you kidding? There was no one. No one, not in the State Department, not in the Pentagon, not in the White House. No one took it seriously. There was no idea of how we would achieve this goal which the President and other world leaders had so seriously announced. So we at the Stimson Center developed a plan. And we have this giant book. You can access it on our website, or I'd be happy to send you copies, and we have a few thousand left, which outlines what a nuclear disarmament treaty and agreement would look like. And I'll just mention some things. First, you have to recognize that it can't happen overnight. There are real international conflicts which make it difficult to get countries to move toward nuclear disarmament, and those need to be resolved. You take the Chemical Weapons Convention, which eliminates chemical weapons. Virtually all the countries in the world have signed that, and there's been huge progress in eliminating chemical stockpiles, but it's been 15 years being implemented. So these things will take time. Personally, I like the goal of 2045. It's 100 years since nuclear weapons were invented. I think that's a realistic goal at which they could be eliminated. And in our book, we have a time schedule by which that could be achieved. The next step has to be one more U.S.-Russian agreement. We had the New START agreement that was ratified after a huge debate and big payoffs to the nuclear labs and other parts of the nuclear infrastructure, at least the promise of that. And that brings us and the Russians to about 1,500 deployed long-range nuclear weapons. But we actually have more than that. We have about 5,000. They have about 8,000. No one else has more than, people aren't sure about China, but maybe 500. But no one else has anything more than 500. So clearly the US and Russia have to come further down before you can expect other countries to join into the disarmament effort, at least in terms of reducing their weapons. So I'm hopeful that in a second term, President Obama will be able to negotiate a new treaty with Russia, which not only limits deployed long-range weapons, but puts a comprehensive ceiling on all nuclear warheads. Now, this raises some issues about how you verify it. We don't actually count warheads now to verify a treaty. We count the launchers, the missiles that would fire them, although we can, in the new treaty, take samplings of the number of warheads on particular missiles, which is a real breakthrough. But if you had an agreement that put limits on all warheads, whether deployed on missiles or in reserve stockpiles, you'd have to be able to walk into weapons storage facilities, and they get a little nervous about that, about giving away secrets and so forth. But there are ways to do it. People have worked out ways to do this that wouldn't compromise any nation's security. So that needs to be the next step. And I think it's feasible over the next 4 years. After that, after we get down to 1,000 warheads each, something like that, it's quite reasonable to expect other countries to join into the negotiation. And there already is a forum for it, the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review, which was met a few years ago. It's reviewed every 5 years. Set up at that review, the 5 declared nuclear weapon states, that's the US, Russia, China, Britain, and France, agreed to start meeting regularly to discuss implementing their commitment in the treaty to disarm. We've already made that commitment in a treaty. It's carefully hedged and so forth, but we've made the commitment. And now we've committed to start meeting. And these 5 countries have met twice a year since that review conference. They haven't done anything to speak of. They set up a committee to talk about the terminology that would be used in a disarmament treaty. But the forum exists at least, and they can begin to discuss things like how you would verify a disarmament treaty, how to start. I mean, some countries like China don't provide data on how many weapons they have, to start talking about greater transparency. So the things that could be done in that forum. Not every country needs to be involved in the beginning. I mean, we don't need North Korea to be involved in this process from the beginning. Hopefully, if China were involved, India would feel compelled to become involved. Pakistan might follow then. But you could get going and you could begin to make a lot of progress, understanding that no one's going to eliminate all their weapons until everyone's willing to eliminate all their weapons. But you could get momentum going and get that process going. The eventual treaty needs to have very detailed verification processes. Countries don't trust one another, and there is a risk that a country would cheat and try to hide some weapons, or would try to break out, using its civilian